Hi everyone, it's Jennifer Dawes, and me and Kirk Munroe are going to talk through relationships versus joins again today. I'm really excited for this conversation. We both have a little bit of a different perspective, and kind of want to jump right in with a few examples. So the last conversation or the last video I shared was using Tableau's data set with bookstore data. We have books, we have author, we have awards. One of the quick examples that I was showing on why relationships can be a bit of a challenge if you don't understand them is the way this data source was wired. If we pull in author name, we have 41 rows. And then the second that we pull over the awards they've received, it shrinks down to 16. Reason this happens is Tableau's making the assumption you want an inner join for these. And so it's going to go ahead and only provide where both exist. So that's kind of one of the challenges I've seen in my team that when we're looking at millions of rows or thousands of rows of records, that if we're not understanding the logic and what's happening behind the scenes, it can be a little sketchy to be using relationships. And I know, Kirk, you have an example, same data source. I'm excited to kind of see your take on how it was engineered, which you were showing me before. And it looks a little bit different than the version Tableau provided. And I'm excited to see the output, what it looks like when you start pulling things onto the screen. I'll stop sharing and let you share your screen.
Um, yeah, I really loved your video, which got me to reach out. And part of the reason was it took me a while. I'll be honest, been using Tableau for a long time too. And relationships first came out, I actually don't think I got them as well as I could have, partly because of that book's data set, to be honest, because I don't think it didn't lend itself that well to relationships in the past. And I was thinking about it when you brought it up because I hadn't looked at it in a long time. I thought, you know what, we should take a look at the way that I would actually build this. And we couldn't have done this at the time. It was only multi-factor relationships. And it was only, I've got a book on data modeling with Tableau that only, I think after I was asked to write it, did I really dive in and like understand these as well as I should have a long time before. So I think I have a blank version of Tableau. So this is what I think the model should look like. But I thought, and please ask me questions like, oh, but this is the exact
Yeah,
same.
yeah.
I downloaded the Excel workbook, which that comes with the link that Jennifer shared already. And the only thing I added was a date for a date scaffold at the end, which I'll show why. Otherwise, it's the stock exact same one from way back in, I guess it was probably April 2022 when it came out. And Bethany's a great post. So the first thing I would think about now that we have multi-factor relationships, this really lends itself to it because there are checkouts, which are library checkouts, and there's sales that the book sold. And to join those together or create relationships between them is almost impossible because the data is not shaped right, but it's transactional data. So what I would do is I would bring sales out to the canvas, whatever you bring first. And you'll notice in her model that you use, she had books first, is the
Yeah.
root, which you almost had to think about then. But now that we have multi-fact, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So you'll see we still can do joins and we can still do joins and unions, of course. So I'm going to make this a
I'm excited.
wildcard. Yeah, I'm going to quickly make this a wildcard union and say, if any of the sheets in this workbook have sales, of which there's only sales one, union those sheets together. So that'll dynamically union ours together. If anyone, I'm always back, and what I love about Tableau is I'm always back and forth to make sure whether things worked without going back. So I can come here and go, yeah, all my quarters came in, right? So, but the other thing is you have to think about is checkouts are also a fact table. So what's a fact table? Is a fact table is a table that just records transactions effectively, has facts or in measures basically. And what
Right.
you showed, which is like a thing that hangs people up on all the time, which gets me, is if when we create these relationships, there's no joins being made until we do something on a sheet, like you talked about. But if you drag a dimension from two different tables, it forces Tableau into an inner join. So
Yes.
we want to try to avoid that situation whenever we can. And we can't always control our data. But so let's say we have checkouts and sales. So what do people check out is they check out books, right? So we're going to go like this, right? And then, so it's got a book ID and Tableau matched on book ID here. But interestingly, uh, sales are on editions because for whatever reason, the library doesn't care what edition of the book you check out. It's just the book. But that's fine. Tableau handles that different level of granularity pretty well. So what we actually want is sales are by edition, right? But then editions are editions of books.
Describing books.
Right. Which is, it's kind of cool how we can build this and we can still check. What's awesome about this is we can check out which books are the most popular on sales relative to checkouts at the library and whether they're the same, right? And actually, ratings, right, are also a fact because there are people can rate many times, right? So, and then, but I think books have ratings. I'm going, without boring people of how you have to do a little bit, but now, like we can answer a lot of questions about books right now. So yeah, yeah. You have any questions?
And it gets interesting. Yeah. So it gets interesting that immediately when you were showing me your structure against what I've seen, and then also what I've seen in the wild out in the business world is instead of it being off of one table and then all of these other pieces are just kind of connected and trying to wire to that one, you have a lot more of a network, I guess would be the best way to describe it, right? Like ratings describe book, checkouts describe book. And your finished version as well, when I was looking at it, it just, to me, it logically makes more sense to create all of the connections versus everything coming off from a single point. And I wonder in my mind, when I saw that, that probably helps with performance to some degree. And I would imagine it also reduces the number of assumptions Tableau has to make, right?
Yeah. And I always think about this with these relationships as more questions with less data. So what I mean by that is because there's no pre-built joins going on here, then we're not filtering anything out by deciding left join or right join, or throwing in a whole bunch of nulls by going full outer to make sure we leave nothing out. And then it's almost ironic, but the join, like there's loads of checkouts here. We could look like there's more sales maybe. So you'll notice there's 56,000 sales and there's only 58 books, right? So if we were to join this book table to the edition table, which is 95 rows, because one book in a multiple editions, to this, we're going to take all these titles and like edition numbers and pages and all this stuff, and we're going to keep duplicating it in columns every single time 56,000 times, which just is bringing in a whole bunch of data we don't need to do. Like, why not let Tableau go fetch that, right? You also mentioned LODs. I think the thing it helps a lot more with is now I can count. Well, we know count distinct's a really nasty calculation. Now I can count book titles, or I can count distinct book titles, and it's the same because I'm not exploding that book table until I bring fields in from multiple of these tables to bring it together, right?
Yeah.
So
absolutely. It makes a lot of. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, let's just keep building it out, right? Because books have authors, which is the only place it makes sense to have an author, right? And then I can't remember what's in the info, but a book has
a publisher. Publisher, award. Yep.
Right. And then oh, that's interesting. So publisher, let's see what's in here. Has marketing pub ID. Maybe a publisher must be to an edition, is it? See, you can, let me do
publisher was an addition. Yep.
So I can just take this and remove it, but this is kind of nice because you can interactively kind of quickly build it, right? So I can go, publisher actually goes to edition. There we go. And books have ratings, and then books also have what was the other thing that it had? It had
awards.
Edition.
Well, I guess awards, authors, the awards, but either,
Yeah. So does the author get the award or does the book get the award? It's a good question. So you have to kind of know, right? So author ID, the award goes to the title of the book. So it's pretty nasty data set, kind of, because you wouldn't want to join on a title. You'd want to join on some kind of ID, right? So here's an example, though, where we talk about, like, my default is relationships for sure. But if you think about, let's say a book could only win one award. Obviously, a book could win multiple awards. In this case, no book has, I think, right? So if it were true that a book couldn't win multiple awards, this is a perfect example of, I would throw it as a join out here. Again, it's not a perfect example because we know a book in theory could win multiple awards, but if it couldn't, the reason I would join it is because it's not adding new rows. Do you know what I mean? So we can think about it in terms of cardinality. If it's one to many or many to one, I almost always default to a relationship. And if it's one to one, I almost always default to a join. And the reason for that is because I'm not exploding my data, and nor am I eliminating any data because I know it's going to fit. Like in this case, obviously I want a left join because a book can not have an award, but an award can't not have a book, right? So by doing this, I'm not adding any new
unnecessary
rows,
right?
So therefore, I'm not exploding my data. And the advantage of this is, in that case, you might as well do the join ahead of time instead of making Tableau run this join when I drag something onto a. So it's kind of the way. Again, it's not a perfect example because it could, at least in theory, it could win multiple awards, right? But imagine in a world where it couldn't, then my model would start to look like this. And then as a result of this, because we have something that I couldn't even wrap my head around how I would do this with joins, to be fair, would be some of the cool things that we could do is we could now say, we have sales, right? We get back to, so this data source is kind of messy, right? Let's just go with the number of times it was sold for now, right? So, and then we can get back to the price of it just because it's messy. But if we went, well, how many sales does it have, right? And how many times was it checked out? Two completely different fact tables, right? At this point, by the way, Tableau didn't join anything. It got this answer and it got this answer and it stitched them together in the viz. Like it used to do, or still does in blends, but it can do it at different levels of aggregation. But it's the same logic for anyone who knows blends, but much easier to write. And then if we took, so there's no join yet, it just stitched those together. But if we then took the book title, which is in books, I think, right? So if we took the title and put it on detail, and I don't know, I like these better circles. And so that would be the number of times. So this book both sold a lot, right? And also, it's easier to see this way. So this is the number of times the book's been checked out of the library, and this is the number of times it's sold. So this book's been sold 7,300 times and been checked out of the library 12. If I did that right, if I built my model right, and then anyway, we could have a lot more fun from then because then you could say, well, we also have an average rating, right? So if we could try to figure out the book we wanted to pick out of the library, we could maybe put rating on size, obviously. That's the average rating, and maybe also on color for it to pop. Anyway, but just I wouldn't know how to build the data model, so this thing's got a high rating and it's checked out. I should probably go read this thing. You know what I mean? Versus this one down here, oh, it didn't check out. But you'll see we didn't eliminate nulls either. Do you see that?
Exactly.
Because there's not two dimensions from two different tables. So we can even see there's a book that we have in our database that's never been checked out or reviewed or sold.
I love that. And I love that you're saying the dimension piece. So I think some of this in my mind is how do I help better inform the team that might build the data source, right? Because in my organization, we have published data sources. And so a lot of this is happening behind the scenes. And the individual that might build this out is going through their mind logically, like we are, on how it might come together. And then it's a different person that's going to be the user. And so for me, it's the gap between the two of how do you build. If I was building it for myself, I can go ahead and I know how it's going to be used. I know the questions that we might be asking, so I can build it for that purpose. But what decisions could you possibly change or would you change if you don't know like longevity of how this data source might be passed down or used?
Yeah. So especially, and was new with 24.2, which made relationships a million times better, in my opinion, when they had this multiple base tables. So
Yes.
if we think about the advantage of relationships is that we don't have to do our joins until, and that one of the disadvantages is two dimensions from different tables forces an inner join. What you want ideally in these base tables, and anyone who knows data warehousing kind of techniques, right? What I want in these base tables is I only want measures and foreign keys, right? So I want measures and a key that tells me all the dimensions about it. And then I want my dimension tables to be hung off it so that I never ever have to pull a dimension from this, right? So because it's got measures and I'm pulling my dimensions from here and it's making the join on key, I get into that never might be pushing it, but I eliminate that null situation because then, like, as you notice, we've got a book way out here that was called, maybe there's an easier way to see this,
that nobody liked.
Called Cimarronal, whatever. I don't know if these are real books, right? And then, so that book out here, the reason why it's coming in, even though there's none. In an old school Tableau, this book just wouldn't show up, right? Because I asked for, sales relationships, and it doesn't have any, right? Or relationships where this dimension of title, I needed to bring a dimension in also from that fact table. But you'll see it's nice because I can see here also the things that didn't sell because of this, right? Or checked out, or got a rating. Right. And I think if I added author, I should be okay. So if we went to our author table and I grabbed my author, I guess I couldn't make first last name, but let's just take last name and add detail. You'll notice they didn't go away. And there's the last name of the writer because I've got dimensions from two different tables, but the measure that we're reporting on is not from either one of those tables. So we're not getting that forced inner join, right? So the idea is, so even though it's got measures from two tables, even though it's got dimensions from two tables, it doesn't bring any of the measures in from either one of those tables. So we're not losing those values, right? So the idea is, so this is a pretty good table, right? Because it doesn't have any real dimensions in it. Is that true? No dimensions in it. This checkout is also, well, it's terrible. We have to create a calculated field to make a date if we kept going, but we could. Do you know what I mean? But again, it's good in that it's only got an ID and measures. So and then ratings, right, is also good, right? But if author name was in here or something, it would be bad because we had to pull that author name in, and then we pulled in from another one. We're not going to see the measures associated with it. So this gets away. So this also works with, I see people scaffold when they scaffold dates, they think they have to scaffold through a join, which explodes your data, but you don't have to most of the time using the same logic. It's just they run into that problem if they join a dimension in from both tables. And again, you can get around that by show missing values, but that's tricky to use. I don't love using that or whatever. So, but this is kind of nice. Just the last thing I would do is this checkout month. So ratings doesn't have a date, which isn't ideal. You'd like to know when it was rated, but we work with what we have, right? The reason I did do that date scaffold, though, is the reason I would do this is I would take this date scaffold, and this one's easy enough. I just go, and all it is like all the days for that year. So I would map sale date to date, right? And then this would normally be easier because this thing would have a date. But what I can do, just to show how flexible it is that date? Yeah, dates. It's here I would have to go, here I go date. If I have multiple fact tables, it'll still work with the same logic. Is here what I want to do is I want to create a relationship calculation to think about this. Date add of month. It's only because we only have a month number, so we're going to assume it's
Yeah,
the same year as the other wacky one,
right.
right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think it would be date at what's it called? We want to add a date add of. I should have kept it up there. What's it
Year.
called? Checkout month.
Oh, sorry, checkout. Yeah.
Checkout month -1, I think, right? Because we're adding 0, right? To we're going to add that to weird Tableau. I think this should work. I think it's 2193 for whatever reason is the year of all the check-ins and that data source. So,
oh, how funny. Okay.
why doesn't it like? That's why. Okay, so I think the year is 2193. We'll check. But basically, what I'm saying is, take whatever month is there, right? Take one away from it, because if it's already the first month, I want to add 0 to it, right?
Yep.
This should build me a date in any case, and then I should be able to join that date to this date. And now the advantage of that is I also don't lose things if I pull this date in, which is really just my last thing here. Is so if I have this special date, so I can go date, and remember we had sales by, yeah, see, it's 2193.
That's so funny.
It's 2193. But say we went quarter or something, right? So we have these 3 quarters. We could say, well, how many checkouts were there, right? That's how many checkouts there were, and how many sales were there, and we could drag that in too, and we would get the sales. And again, we're not going to get that 0 problem because they're referencing a date field. We're referencing a date field that's in neither one of the other two, and it's only joining to get it back, which is kind of nice, right? And then obviously we could do whatever we wanted from here. We could say, even though they're not joined, I guess the very last thing would be, we could say, so who's the most popular author? Whoops, did definitely mean to do that. So it could be slicker than this, but create calculate field. Whoops.
It's yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise it would just, I don't know how many dupes we would get. So if we did that as full name, which isn't in there, and then we put full name in there, we could see sales by author regardless of, we'd have to dig into why there's a null there. But anyway, if we have more time to dig around, we can figure out why. Like, there might not be an author. But again, it's pretty easy to even find those nulls now in this kind of way of playing around with it or whatever.
Well,
so.
I think right away, it's giving me even more to think about, right? It's, first of all, what is the data? What are the tables? What do they look like? Are you pulling dimensions from multiple tables and using relationships to connect them? And if so, that's probably where we're going to see challenges, because you're pulling in dimensions and then measures from like Tableau. What other assumption would Tableau make beyond an inner join? And I think the other key is you're mentioning the Tableau update, where we can have the multiple connections, where originally with relationships, everything was having to come from one source. So it did create more challenges. So I guess the question would be, if you were to train somebody and it's their first time using Tableau, what would you teach them? Would you teach them how to use a join? Would you go back to some basics? Would you show them relationships? What do you think would have the easiest learning curve?
It's a great question. The first thing I try to figure out is whether they're a SQL expert or not. And it's actually easier, ironically, I think, to teach them if they're not. So I have to kind of unteach them SQL a little bit. Not unteach them SQL, but the way Tableau generates SQL. So if they don't know SQL, the great thing is I start with that, less data, more answers, right? And then only join if the card, if it doesn't add rows, which means the cardinality is 1-to-1, but that's a technical term. So I try to get you not adding rows. But mostly what's great about it is I think about, what are the distinct things that you measure in your company, right? And the tables that control those, put them in this base table. And otherwise, think about it. This is almost like the equivalent of the Andy Kriebel write a sentence to do a table calc. I do it for this, and why I think relationships are so good is just start thinking about the relationships literally between your tables, right? So we first put in sales, ratings, and checkouts because those are things we measure. And then I'm like, okay, how do we measure sales? Well, we measure sales by editions because people buy editions. And then what do they have? They have editions of books, right? And what do they check out? Well, they only check out books. And authors don't sell anything. We don't sell authors. They don't have ratings or checkouts. Books do, but books have authors, right? And then, and editions have publishers because the same book can get published by multiple publishers. So I try to get them to think about it as a sentence, like what relates between these tables. And then, like I said, just as a last step, say, now could we, like we did with this one with awards, right? So let's open this one up. And again, it's not a perfect example because it could win multiple awards. But again, we're playing that scenario where it couldn't. If they did it like this, at the end, I would just be, oh, can we simplify this at all? Because, are there ever awards without books? Like, no, there's not award. We never want to ask questions about awards on their own, right? So you might as well join them in the books, right? So fundamentally, any table you're left with has value. You could think about it at the end, asking questions about alone, right? So we might want to know just how many authors are in our data set. This lets us answer it without having to remember to count distinctive as an example, which is a relatively expensive calculation because we just count authors on their own. And it's not an exploded data set. It's just a table of authors, right? So that's the way. It does take a while. I think, I've been doing this data source talking about now, I think, for a couple of years, and I think I get a little better all the time because it does take a while to wrap your head around because, especially if you come from a SQL background where you think about how do I jam all this stuff together.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. You do have to unlearn a few things, right? That's where it just kind of depends on what we know and what we're coming with, and then what each of these tables look like in terms of, do we have flexibility to isolate measures, or are we working with tables that have a mix of measures and dimensions? What does that look like? How do we, I love you saying less data, more answers. So what does it look like to pull in only the pieces that we absolutely need for the output that we know? And I know all of that, and also know in full disclosure that we can only control what we can. And
yes, of course.
There are times where we're building this for our own consumption, and then data sources that are published and out there for mass uses. I think the other piece that we still don't have a perfect workaround for in my organization is once it's published, if we were to create a workbook and publish this, great, but then you could also immediately publish this as a data source that others could go use. When you have a relationship, you don't have the ability to then add another field to it, right? I couldn't connect a published data source into Tableau Prep and add something else if later downstream we need to make more changes. But to me, that also comes back to the full conversation of where are we making our transformations? Should it be happening in Tableau? Should it be happening in our actual data source, Snowflake, or whatever it is? But
what was announced at TC last year, which is going to be big, is in a not too far in the future release, is my understanding, is there's going to be something called composable data sources where you can add relationships of tables into published data sources.
Wow.
Which is going to be huge. So this was needed at first, this multi-factor relationship, in order to do that. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been practical. The second thing Tableau did was, now at least, and Sean Miller has a blog on Tableau's blog about this, is, although it kind of is what it is, like now at least when you connect to a published data source from Tableau Cloud, or if there's a 24.3 a server, I'm terrible for keeping track of that. When you connect to a published data source, you see this graph now. You see this model at least. So as an end user, although you can't add to it, at least you know what you're looking at. So I think there's a lot of skepticism around building these because I didn't know what I was looking at, right? The next thing that's coming in 25.1, presumably, which I just wrote a blog on today, but we can't publish or talk about too much until it comes out, is table level filters, which you need. So if I were to add a data source filter today, it forces joins to all the tables that relate to that, but as opposed to effectively just passing a where clause to the table I want to pass it to. So that would be bad with a published data source especially. So that's coming in the next release. And then there's a whole bunch of other cool stuff coming, but hopefully we're not too far away from composable data sources, because then
I think that is
that just
powerful.
opens up from a data governance,
Yeah.
you know, it's going to be really, really, really big for sure.
Yeah,
right. But
absolutely.
these things had to happen first, which I know a lot of people in the community are frustrated because like, I thought they'd come out quicker. I'm like, well, there's a lot of query layer stuff under the scenes that had to get updated. I could say fixed, but at least updated in order to realistically handle. Otherwise, the queries would have been way too nasty and slow. And so they're making these incremental steps, but that will be really, really big for sure.
Yeah. And I think that is important that it's happening in incremental steps, because if anybody's ever worked with a data set, this is a small example, but scale this and try to build a dashboard, the computing time can be like, it can really come to a grind. So I'm excited to see future updates and kind of we're also working feverishly on transparency. So I love the idea. I have to go look and see which version it is, where the developers can see the visual of what.
Yeah, 24.3. So the
24.3.
what would be current as we're recording it. Yeah.
Okay, that's exciting.
So,
I think that would really help.
Yeah, if you're in Tableau Cloud and connect to a published data source now, you see it, which is awesome. It's just in a gray box that you can't touch, but at least you can see it. Oh, and you can come in and highlight like that to see that relationship. So you can do this. So at least some people can go, what? Why are sales connected to additions? And I'm like, oh, they're connected by addition to, like, see, it'll show you what.
That's helpful. Yeah.
Right. So it's a logical step for sure. So again, some people are frustrated not everything's there yet, but that's the reason why understanding what the developers are working on behind the scenes of it.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. It's really exciting. I'm glad to connect with you and see the different ways to pull this together, and relationships as it continues to evolve and more updates become available. I'm excited to see more use cases. But I'm all for learning the why behind it so that we understand and know when to use it and how to leverage it appropriately. So awesome.
Okay, well, thanks, Jennifer, for the conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much.
Okay, you too.